If the entire story of humankind were compressed into a single 24-hour day, everything we recognize as civilization would appear only in the final 5 minutes before midnight. The pyramids, ancient Rome, modern technology. 5 minutes. So here's the question history rarely asks. What were we doing for the other 23 hours and 55 minutes? For most of our existence, human beings lived without cities, without writing, and without monuments that could survive time. They were born, they aged, and they died in a world that left almost no permanent trace behind. And because there are no books written by their hands, we have trained ourselves to believe their lives were simple, repetitive, and empty of meaning. But evidence does not support that comfort. Researchers estimate that more than 95% of Homo sapiens' time on Earth exists outside recorded history. Not because nothing happened, but because almost everything happened in ways that could not be archived. Fires turned to ash, wood decayed, voices vanished the moment they were spoken. Even entire ways of life disappeared without leaving a single sentence behind. The absence of writing, however, is not the absence of thought. Long before the first cities emerged, humans were already fully capable of abstract reasoning, emotional depth, and long-term planning. They formed relationships that lasted decades. They remembered landscapes across generations. They taught skills that required patience, precision, and shared understanding. These were not accidental behaviors. They were learned, practiced, and refined over immense spans of time. The problem is not that this era lacks complexity. The problem is that complexity left no library. Modern society often begins its story with civilization, because civilization produces records. Once writing appears, memory becomes external, durable, and controllable. From that moment forward, history feels solid. Before it, everything seems uncertain, and uncertainty is often mistaken for insignificance. But the human brain did not suddenly awaken with the invention of writing. Anatomically, modern humans had already existed for hundreds of thousands of years. The same neurological structures that allow you to imagine the future, feel nostalgia, or fear the unknown were already present long before the first alphabet. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable idea. If our minds were already modern, then our inner lives were already rich, which means the people who lived during those forgotten hours were not incomplete versions of us. They were us, living under different conditions, guided by different constraints, and embedded in a world far more directly shaped by nature than by architecture. And this world endured. For tens of thousands of years, humans survived ice ages, extreme droughts, shifting ecosystems, and unfamiliar landscapes. They spread across continents without maps, adapted to environments ranging from deserts to frozen tundra, and did so without the technologies we consider essential today. These were not short experiments. They were stable ways of life that persisted far longer than any civilization has so far. Which raises a troubling possibility. If human beings lived successfully without cities for the vast majority of their existence, then civilization is not the natural baseline of our species. It is a recent development, powerful, transformative, and deeply disruptive. It solved many problems, but it also introduced new ones that our nervous systems may not have been designed to handle. This does not mean the past was a paradise. It was harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving. But it was also coherent. Survival depended on awareness, cooperation, and a deep familiarity with the living world. Time was not measured by clocks. Value was not stored in objects. Identity was not tied to occupation or status. When we look back at that immense stretch of time, we are not looking at a preface to history. We are looking at history itself. A version that does not fit neatly into timelines or textbooks, and perhaps that is why it unsettles us. because buried within those lost hours is a question that civilization has never fully answered. If we lived that way for so long, what exactly did we become when we stopped? History, as we usually understand it, begins with a quiet assumption that nothing truly important happened until someone wrote it down. The moment symbols were pressed into clay or carved into stone, the past suddenly became visible. Names appeared, dates appeared, lineages could be traced, power could be recorded. From that moment forward, human experience gained a structure that feels familiar to us, a sequence of events, causes, and consequences. Everything before that moment is treated differently. It is summarized, condensed, and reduced to a single label: prehistory. A word that subtly suggests waiting, as if humanity were standing still, anticipating civilization like an inevitable arrival, as if tens of thousands of years were merely a prologue rather than a fully lived reality. But this framing does not align with the evidence. Archaeologists do not uncover signs of a species in limbo. They uncover continuity. Stone tools change gradually over immense periods, becoming more refined, more specialized, more efficient. Campsites show repeated use across generations, suggesting memory of place and seasonal return. Migration routes follow patterns that imply knowledge passed down deliberately, not random wandering driven by chance. Yet when we attempt to tell this story, something breaks down. Human memory, especially collective memory, depends on compression. It favors events that can be fixed to dates and locations. A city can be mapped, a battle can be narrated, a ruler can be named. But how do you record a way of life defined not by events, but by rhythms? How do you preserve 10,000 years of movement between landscapes, or countless evenings spent around fires where stories were told, reshaped, and forgotten again? You cannot, not in the way modern history prefers. And so, when faced with something that resists structure, we did what societies often do. We ignored it. The rise of civilization provided a convenient boundary. Before it, chaos and instinct. After it, order and intelligence. This narrative reassures us that the present is superior by default, that complexity must always increase, and that modern life represents the inevitable destination of human progress. But the material record complicates this comfort. Some researchers suggest that early human societies possessed forms of knowledge that were highly sophisticated, yet fragile. Knowledge that existed only through practice and memory. Knowledge embedded in landscapes, in animal behavior, in the timing of plants and seasons. Knowledge that vanished not because it was inferior, but because it could not survive the collapse or transformation of the social systems that carried it. When a city falls, its ruins remain. When a nomadic culture disappears, almost nothing does. This imbalance shapes how we remember. Civilization leaves scars on the earth: walls, roads, mines, monuments. Pre-civilized humanity left traces that the planet quickly erased. Over time, absence was mistaken for insignificance. There is also a deeper reason why our collective memory begins so late. The world before civilization challenges modern assumptions about what it means to live well. In that world, survival did not depend on accumulation. There were no permanent surpluses, no stored wealth meant to last beyond immediate need. Security came from relationships, not possessions. A person's value was tied to contribution, awareness, and cooperation. Time was experienced cyclically, shaped by seasons and movement, not divided into units to be spent or saved. These ideas sit uneasily within societies built on productivity, growth, and control. To acknowledge that humans lived differently and successfully for most of their existence is to question whether our current systems are inevitable, optimal, or even sustainable. And so, consciously or not, we minimize that past. We teach it as a blur. We portray its people as crude. We hurry toward civilization as quickly as possible. But in doing so, we lose context. We lose the understanding that the instincts shaping our fears, our social needs, and our sense of belonging were forged long before cities existed. We forget that our bodies and minds did not evolve in crowded streets or artificial light, but in landscapes where attention meant survival and community meant safety. Those forgotten hours are not irrelevant. They are foundational. Until we understand why human memory begins so late, we will continue to misunderstand what it means to be human. And that leads us to the next, more unsettling question, one that sits beneath every myth of progress. Before civilization rewrote the rules of survival, who were the humans who lived by the old ones? Long before the first city was built, long before agriculture reshaped the land, a human being already existed who would be instantly recognizable to you. If you pass them on a train platform today, clean-shaven, dressed in modern clothing, you would not stop and stare. Their posture, their hands, the proportions of their face would feel familiar. There would be no obvious sign that this person belonged to a world separated from yours by hundreds of thousands of years. According to current evidence, anatomically modern humans appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. Their skeletons reveal bodies built just like ours. Their skulls contain brains the same size as modern human brains. The neural architecture that supports language, imagination, emotional depth, and complex social behavior was already in place. In other words, the hardware was complete. This realization quietly dismantles a comforting myth that intelligence slowly increased until it finally produced real humans. The evidence suggests something far more unsettling. Modern humans did not gradually become intelligent through civilization. They arrived already equipped with minds capable of far more than they would use for tens of thousands of years. And they did not arrive alone. At the time when Homo sapiens began to spread, the world was not empty. It was shared. Europe was dominated by Neanderthals, robust, cold-adapted humans with large brains and deep knowledge of harsh environments. In parts of Asia lived the Denisovans, known to us mostly through fragments, yet genetically influential enough to leave traces in living populations today. On distant islands, other human relatives evolved in isolation, adapting to environments in ways we are only beginning to understand. This was not a simple evolutionary ladder. It was a crowded landscape of humanity. Different human species hunted, raised children, crafted tools, and responded to the world in their own ways. They were not failed versions of us. They were successful, stable populations that survived for hundreds of thousands of years. Some buried their dead. Some cared for injured individuals who could not survive alone. These behaviors imply empathy, memory, and social obligation, traits once thought exclusive to modern humans. Which raises a critical question. If multiple human species were intelligent, adaptive, and socially complex, then intelligence alone does not explain why only one survived. The common explanation focuses on physical advantages, better endurance, more efficient movement, superior tools. But these factors tell only part of the story. Neanderthals were physically stronger. They thrived in environments that would have destroyed less resilient populations. Denisovans adapted to extreme altitudes long before modern humans learned to do so. And yet, they vanished. Homo sapiens did not merely outlive them. In many regions, sapiens replaced them. Some researchers suggest interbreeding blurred the lines between species, absorbing fragments of others into a growing population. Others point to competition for resources, shifting climates, or demographic advantages. But none of these explanations fully resolve the mystery, because survival on this scale is rarely about muscle or tools alone. It is about coordination. It is about trust between strangers. It is about shared belief. Something allowed sapiens to form larger, more flexible social networks than any other human species. Groups that could expand, reorganize, and absorb newcomers without collapsing. Groups bound not only by kinship, but by ideas, shared stories about who they were, what mattered, and how the world worked. These ideas left few physical traces. They existed in minds, voices, gestures, and rituals. They shaped behavior without carving monuments. They coordinated action without centralized authority. And they may have given Homo sapiens an advantage so subtle that it took tens of thousands of years to reveal its consequences. Because once you can convince many individuals to act as one, to trust, to plan, to sacrifice for an abstract idea, you change what survival means. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable implication of all. If anatomically modern humans existed long before civilization, and if their minds were already capable of imagination, symbolism, and belief, then the true transformation of our species did not begin with cities or writing. It began somewhere else, not in stone or soil, but inside the mind. And whatever happened there may explain not only why we survived, but why every other human species eventually disappeared. To imagine the ancient world as empty and waiting is a mistake shaped by hindsight. When Homo sapiens began to expand beyond Africa, they did not step onto a vacant stage. They entered a world already occupied by others who walked upright, shaped stone, hunted cooperatively, and understood their environments with precision. Europe was not a wilderness awaiting discovery. It was Neanderthal land. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals had adapted to cold climates, mastering fire, crafting tools suited for close-range hunting, and surviving ice ages that repeatedly reshaped the continent. Their bodies were powerful, their brains large, and their lives anything but simple. Evidence suggests they cared for the injured, shared food, and maintained social bonds strong enough to support individuals who could not survive alone. In Asia, the picture becomes even more complex. Denisovans, known mostly through fragments of bone and DNA, occupied vast regions we can barely trace. Yet their genetic legacy persists today, especially among populations adapted to extreme environments. This implies not only survival, but sophisticated biological responses to altitude, climate, and disease developed long before modern science could explain them. And beyond these groups were others, small-bodied humans on isolated islands, populations that evolved along paths now almost completely erased. Each adapted to their environment, each survived for millennia. None were fleeting experiments of evolution. This was not a single human story. It was many. For tens of thousands of years, different human species shared the planet. They encountered one another. They competed. In some cases, they interbred. This is not speculation. Genetic evidence confirms it. Many living humans today carry traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry, quiet reminders that the boundaries between us and them were never absolute. So why did only one lineage remain? The disappearance of other human species is not fully understood. Climate shifts likely played a role, reshaping habitats faster than some populations could adapt. Competition for resources may have intensified as environments changed. Small population sizes made groups vulnerable to sudden loss. None of these explanations are incorrect, but none are sufficient on their own. Because extinction is rarely caused by a single factor, what sets Homo sapiens apart may not have been strength, endurance, or intelligence in the conventional sense. It may have been something more elusive, something harder to fossilize. Some researchers suggest that sapiens possessed a unique ability to form large, flexible social networks. While other human species lived in relatively small, tightly bound groups, sapiens could connect beyond immediate kin. They could cooperate with strangers, They could coordinate behavior across distances. They could maintain shared identities even as groups grew larger and more dispersed. This kind of cooperation requires more than communication. It requires belief. Belief in shared stories, shared symbols, shared meanings that exist only because many individuals agree they do. These shared fictions about identity, obligation, and belonging can bind groups together more tightly than blood alone. They allow communities to reorganize, absorb newcomers, and survive disruption. If this is true, then the decisive advantage of Homo sapiens was not technological. It was psychological. A mind capable of imagining realities that do not physically exist and persuading others to act as if they do. This ability would not leave clear marks in stone or bone. It would exist in rituals, in gestures, in words spoken and forgotten. It would shape behavior without announcing itself. And over thousands of years, it could slowly tilt the balance of survival. Other human species were not inferior. They were different. And in a world where adaptability increasingly depended on cooperation at scale, difference may have been enough. The disappearance of Neanderthals and Denisovans does not mark a triumph of progress. It marks a narrowing, a reduction from many ways of being human to just one. The world became quieter, less diverse, even as one lineage spread across every continent. And that raises a final, unsettling thought. If Homo sapiens survived not because they were stronger, but because they could believe together, then the force that shaped our dominance is the same force that still shapes our societies today. Stories, symbols, shared realities that feel solid even when they are not. To understand what humans did before civilization, we must understand when those invisible forces first took hold. Because once humans learned to live inside shared ideas, the world would never be the same again. At some point in deep prehistory, something subtle changed. Not in the shape of the human body, and not in the size of the brain, but in how that brain was used. There is no single fossil that marks this shift, no sudden mutation that can be dated with certainty. What we see instead is a gradual transformation in behavior that hints at a new kind of mind coming online. This change did not make humans stronger or faster. It made them capable of something far more unusual: imagining things that did not physically exist. Other animals communicate. Some even cooperate in complex ways. But humans began to do something different. They could share mental images of absent objects, future events, and invisible forces. They could describe a hunt that had not yet happened. They could warn about dangers not currently present. They could plan together using ideas rather than immediate signals. In evolutionary terms, this was not a small upgrade. It was a new operating system. Archaeological evidence suggests that around this time, human behavior becomes noticeably more flexible. Tools begin to vary by region, not just function. This implies teaching, tradition, and identity. Personal ornaments appear, beads, pigments, shells carried far from their natural sources. These objects serve no survival purpose in the narrow sense. They do not kill prey or provide shelter. Their value lies entirely in what they represent: identity, belonging, meaning. To create and maintain these meanings, a group must agree on them. A bead is only a symbol if others recognize it as such. A gesture only matters if its meaning is shared. This requires a mind capable of holding abstract concepts and a social environment capable of reinforcing them. Some researchers describe this as a cognitive revolution. Others are more cautious, suggesting a slow accumulation rather than a sudden leap. What matters is not the label, but the implication. Humans began to live not only in the physical world, but in a mental one layered on top of it. And once that happened, cooperation changed scale. A group bound by shared ideas can grow larger than a group bound only by kinship. It can survive the loss of individuals. It can coordinate across distance and time. It can remember rules, obligations, and stories long after the original participants are gone. This does not require writing. It requires narrative. Around campfires, humans began to tell stories that explained why the world was the way it was. Stories about animals, ancestors, spirits, and unseen forces that governed luck and danger. These stories did more than entertain. They aligned behavior. They taught lessons. They defined what was acceptable and what was forbidden. In this sense, imagination became a survival tool. Not because imagined things were real, but because belief in them produced real outcomes. Groups that trusted one another survived better than groups that did not. Groups that shared expectations could act quickly and decisively. Over time, these advantages compounded. Yet this development carried a hidden cost. Once humans learned to inhabit shared mental worlds, those worlds could diverge from physical reality. Beliefs could become rigid. Stories could demand loyalty even when circumstances changed. A tool that enhanced cooperation could also amplify conflict, especially when different groups lived by incompatible narratives. The archaeological record cannot tell us what these early stories were. Words do not fossilize, but their effects are visible in patterns of movement, settlement, and material culture. Humans began to organize themselves around ideas that extended beyond immediate survival. And this raises a profound question. If the ability to imagine shared realities shaped our past so deeply, then civilization did not invent this capacity. It inherited it. Cities, laws, and religions are later expressions of a much older skill. Which means that long before the first temples were built, humans were already living inside invisible structures of meaning. And once a species begins to shape reality with ideas, there is no clear way back. The next step is to ask what kind of life emerged from this mental transformation, not in monuments or myths, but in daily existence. How did people actually live once imagination, cooperation, and ecological knowledge combine? To answer that, we must step away from symbols and return to the ground itself, to the rhythms of a life spent moving through forests, plains, and coasts. Because the world of the hunter-gatherer was not a primitive pause before civilization. It was a fully developed way of being human, one that sustained our species for longer than any society ever has. Once humans developed the ability to imagine realities beyond what they could see, something irreversible occurred. Survival was no longer governed solely by strength, speed, or even intelligence in the narrow sense. It became shaped by consensus, by what groups agreed was true, meaningful, and worth defending. This was not deception in the modern sense. It was coordination through belief. When a group of humans shared the same symbols, the same stories, and the same explanations for how the world worked, they could function as a single organism. Individuals could trust that others would act predictably, even in uncertainty. They could make sacrifices in the present for outcomes that existed only in the collective imagination: future safety, ancestral approval, group survival. Anthropologists sometimes describe this as the emergence of shared fictions, though the word fiction can be misleading. These ideas were not trivial or playful. They were binding. They dictated behavior, shaped identity, and enforced cooperation. A rule did not need to be written to be real. It only needed to be believed by enough people. This ability allowed Homo sapiens to do something no other human species appears to have done at scale: cooperate flexibly with large numbers of non-kin. A Neanderthal group might function effectively within a small, tightly bonded circle. A sapiens group could expand, split, reunite, and absorb outsiders without losing cohesion, as long as shared meanings remained intact. Symbols made this possible. A mark, a bead, a color, a gesture. Each could signal belonging. Each could communicate trust or threat instantly, without explanation. Over time, these symbols accumulated layers of meaning that structured social life. Who could hunt together? Who could mate? Who was protected? Who was excluded? None of this required centralized authority. It required belief reinforced through repetition. Stories told to children, rituals performed at key moments, shared explanations for misfortune and success. When a hunt failed, the reason was not randomness, it was meaning, anger, imbalance, violation of a rule. When a hunt succeeded, it confirmed that the group's understanding of the world was correct. In this way, belief systems stabilized behavior. They reduced uncertainty in an unpredictable environment. And in evolutionary terms, predictability is valuable. But this system also introduced a new vulnerability. Once survival depends on shared beliefs, disagreement becomes dangerous. A challenge to the story is no longer just an intellectual difference. It is a threat to cohesion. And so, even in deep prehistory, belief likely carried consequences. Conformity mattered. Deviance may have been punished, not out of cruelty, but out of perceived necessity. The archaeological record offers indirect hints of this tension. Periods of rapid cultural change are often followed by long stretches of stability. Tool styles persist with remarkable consistency, even when alternative designs might have worked just as well. This suggests that tradition, doing things the accepted way, was valued as much as efficiency. Stability is reassuring, but it can also slow adaptation. The power that allowed sapiens to dominate, shared belief, was double-edged. It enabled cooperation on an unprecedented scale, but it also tied groups to particular ways of seeing the world. Once a narrative took hold, it shaped perception itself. What people noticed, what they ignored, what they considered possible. And this pattern did not disappear with time. Civilizations did not invent ideology, they expanded it. The religions, nations, and economic systems of the modern world operate on the same underlying mechanism that bound small bands of hunter-gatherers together tens of thousands of years ago. The scale has changed, the structure has changed, but the mental machinery is ancient, which means the roots of modern conflict do not lie in technology or cities alone. They lie in the same cognitive upgrade that once ensured our survival. To understand life before civilization, we cannot view early humans as passive inhabitants of nature. They were active interpreters of reality, constantly shaping their world through meaning. Their lives were structured by belief just as surely as ours are today, only the symbols were different. And this leads us away from the mind and back into the body. Because belief alone does not sustain a species. It must be matched with daily practice, how people eat, move, work, rest, and relate to the land around them. To truly understand what humans did during those lost hours, we must look closely at the way they lived day to day, not as caricatures of hardship, but as skilled participants in complex ecosystems. That world begins with a misconception we have repeated for centuries. The idea that hunter-gatherers were barely surviving. The evidence suggests something very different. The phrase hunter-gatherer often conjures a misleading image. A life spent in constant desperation, narrowly avoiding starvation, driven by instinct rather than understanding. This image persists not because it is supported by evidence, but because it reassures modern assumptions about progress. A life without agriculture is assumed to be fragile. A life without cities is assumed to be inefficient. But when researchers examine the details, a different picture emerges. For most of human existence, survival depended not on domination of nature, but on intimate familiarity with it. Hunter-gatherer societies were not wandering aimlessly through the landscape. They moved with intention, guided by seasonal rhythms, animal migrations, and the subtle signals of plants and weather. Their survival strategies were not improvised day by day. They were inherited systems of knowledge refined over generations. Anthropological studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies, used cautiously as analogs, suggest that daily subsistence often required far less labor than modern work schedules. Estimates vary, but many indicate that adults spent only 4 to 5 hours per day securing food. The remaining time was devoted to tool-making, social interaction, rest, storytelling, and observation of the environment. This does not imply an easy life. It implies an efficient one. Efficiency in this context was not measured by surplus or growth, but by balance. Knowing when not to hunt was as important as knowing when to hunt. Overexploitation meant future scarcity. Sustainability was not an abstract concept. It was an immediate necessity enforced by consequence. The depth of ecological knowledge required for this way of life is difficult to overstate. Individuals recognized hundreds of plant species, understood their medicinal properties, seasonal availability, and interactions with animals. They could track prey across complex terrain, reading subtle disturbances in soil and vegetation that are invisible to untrained eyes. They understood animal behavior well enough to predict movement, anticipate danger, and coordinate group action without spoken commands. This knowledge was not written. It was embodied. Children learned by watching, imitating, and participating. Mistakes carried risk, which made learning precise. Over time, the landscape itself became a living archive. Every river bend, grove, and rock formation carried meaning, lessons encoded in memory rather than text. Social organization reflected this ecological intelligence. Groups tended to remain relatively small, allowing for flexibility and rapid decision-making. Leadership, where it existed, was situational rather than permanent. Authority was earned through skill, experience, and trust, not inherited status. Cooperation was essential, but coercion was limited by mobility. If a group became oppressive, people could leave. This mobility functioned as a social regulator. In many cases, resources were shared rather than accumulated. Hoarding was discouraged because it threatened group cohesion. A successful hunt was not a private achievement, it was a collective asset. This practice reduced inequality and buffered individuals against misfortune. No one could predict when they would be injured, sick, or unlucky. The result was a social system that emphasized resilience over expansion. From a biological perspective, this way of life appears to have been well matched to the human body. Skeletal evidence suggests robust bone structure, low incidence of certain chronic diseases, and physical conditioning shaped by varied movement rather than repetitive labor. While injury and infection posed serious risks, the overall pattern does not support the idea of a population constantly on the brink of collapse. And perhaps most striking is the duration of this success. Hunter-gatherer lifeways sustained Homo sapiens across dramatic climate shifts, including multiple ice ages. They enabled humans to occupy environments as diverse as tropical forests, arid deserts, coastal margins, and frozen tundra. This was not a temporary phase. It was the dominant mode of human existence for over 90% of our history. Which raises a difficult question. If this way of life was so effective, so adaptable, and so enduring, why do we describe it as primitive? The answer may lie not in the past, but in the present, because acknowledging the intelligence of the wild forces us to reconsider what we mean by advancement. It suggests that complexity does not always move in one direction, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that progress may involve trade-offs we rarely account for. And to understand those trade-offs, we must look beyond survival and efficiency and examine how this way of life shaped human relationships, health, and equality. Because the world of the hunter-gatherer was not just an economic system. It was a social one, and it functioned in ways that challenge modern expectations. When we imagine life before civilization, we often imagine bodies worn down by hardship and minds consumed by survival. Yet the physical evidence tells a more complicated story. Skeletal remains from pre-agricultural populations frequently show strong bones, well-developed muscle attachment, and relatively low incidence of degenerative diseases associated with sedentary living. These were bodies shaped by constant variation in movement, walking, running, lifting, resting, rather than repetitive labor. This does not mean life was safe. Injury, infection, and sudden death were real risks. Infant mortality was high. But among those who survived childhood, many lived into ages comparable with pre-industrial populations. The idea that prehistoric humans universally died young is misleading. What shortened average lifespan was not early aging, but early loss. In terms of daily health, there is evidence that hunter-gatherer diets were diverse and nutritionally dense. People consumed a wide range of plants and animals, adjusted seasonally and regionally. There was no single staple crop to fail. Periods of scarcity occurred, but so did periods of abundance, and groups adapted their movement accordingly. Just as important as physical health was social structure. Most hunter-gatherer societies appear to have been remarkably egalitarian, especially when compared to later agricultural communities. There were differences in skill and reputation, but few permanent hierarchies. Wealth, as we define it today, did not accumulate because there was little reason for it to do so. Mobility discouraged ownership. What could not be carried easily was rarely kept. This had profound social consequences. Food sharing was common, not as charity but as insurance. A successful hunt today did not guarantee success tomorrow. By sharing, individuals invested in future reciprocity. Over time, this reduced extreme inequality and strengthened group bonds. Survival was not a solitary achievement, but a collective one. Gender roles varied across cultures and environments, but evidence suggests that women's contributions, particularly through gathering, processing food, and knowledge transmission, were central to group survival. In many contexts, gathered foods provided the majority of daily calories. This challenges later narratives that equate hunting with dominance and value. Children, too, occupied a different social space. They were not isolated within nuclear families, but embedded within the group. Care was distributed. Learning occurred through participation rather than formal instruction. Observation, play, and gradual responsibility replaced rigid schooling. This environment allowed knowledge to pass fluidly between generations. Conflict existed, but its scale was limited. Without stored wealth or fixed territory, there was little incentive for prolonged warfare. Disputes could often be resolved through separation rather than conquest. Mobility functioned as a release valve, preventing tensions from hardening into permanent structures of power. In this context, wealth was measured differently. It was not counted in possessions, but in relationships, in knowing the land, in having skills others respected, in being part of a group that would support you when circumstances turned against you. Security was social, not material. This way of life did not require constant growth. It required balance, and balance, once achieved, could be maintained for astonishing lengths of time. Which brings us back to a question that refuses to disappear. If human societies functioned in this way for tens of thousands of years, healthy enough, resilient enough, and socially coherent, what force was strong enough to pull us away from it? Why did humans abandon mobility, equality, and ecological intimacy for a life of fields, fences, and fixed settlements? The answer does not begin with progress. It begins with pressure. And to understand that pressure, we must move into a world that grew colder, harsher, and far less predictable. A world shaped by ice, fear, and movement. The world of the Ice Age. For most of the time humans lived as hunter-gatherers, the planet was not stable. It was locked in a long cycle of cold and retreat, advance and collapse. What we casually call the Ice Age was not a single event, but a series of climatic pulses that reshaped the Earth again and again over tens of thousands of years. Glaciers expanded, swallowing entire regions. Sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing vast stretches of land now hidden beneath the oceans. Deserts shifted. Forests disappeared and returned. The world was never still long enough to become familiar. This instability placed constant pressure on human groups. Survival depended not only on knowledge of the land, but on the ability to abandon it. Places that sustained life for generations could suddenly become uninhabitable. Rivers dried, game vanished, cold pushed south, heat returned without warning. In this world, staying still was often the most dangerous option. Movement became a strategy, not a reaction. Humans learned to follow shifting ecological corridors, coastlines rich in marine life, river systems that acted as natural highways, and seasonal routes traced by migrating animals. Over time, these paths became traditions, remembered and retold, passed down as part of cultural memory. The Ice Age also created opportunities. Lower sea levels revealed land bridges that connected continents. One of the most significant was Beringia, a vast stretch of tundra linking northeastern Asia and North America. For thousands of years, it was not a crossing but a homeland, a place where humans lived, hunted, and adapted before moving onward. Other crossings were even more remarkable. Evidence suggests that humans reached Australia tens of thousands of years ago, requiring deliberate sea travel. This was not accidental drift. It implies planning, construction of watercraft, and the ability to imagine land beyond the visible horizon. Long before navigation instruments, humans were already committing to journeys with no guarantee of return. Fear was constant, but it was not paralyzing. Cold kills quickly. Hunger weakens slowly. Predators competed for the same prey. Darkness lasted longer in winter. Yet humans adapted by layering technology with cooperation. Clothing, shelters, fire, and shared labor worked together as systems. No single innovation explained survival. It was the integration of many small solutions that mattered. Fire, in particular, became more than a tool. It was protection, warmth, and light, but also a social center. It extended the day, reshaped sleep, and created a space where stories, planning, and teaching could occur. Under a frozen sky, fire turned night into a communal experience rather than a threat. The Ice Age also intensified dependence on one another. In harsh conditions, isolation was fatal. Groups that failed to coordinate, who hunted alone, hoarded resources, or fractured under stress, did not last long. Selection favored those who could maintain cooperation even when pressure was extreme. And still, humans kept moving. Across Eurasia, along coastlines, into the Americas, over mountains and through frozen plains. Not as a single migration, but as countless small decisions repeated over generations. Each step taken without knowledge of what lay ahead. Which raises a question that is easy to overlook. What kind of mind commits to movement on this scale? Not migration driven by panic, but exploration sustained over millennia. Not escape, but expansion into environments that offered no immediate reward. To walk into cold, unknown land required more than desperation. It required curiosity, confidence in collective knowledge, and belief that survival was possible beyond the horizon. The Ice Age did not just test humanity, it shaped it. The pressures of cold and uncertainty selected for flexibility, cooperation, and imagination. Humans who could adapt their stories, tools, and social structures survived. Those who could not disappeared. And yet, despite all this movement, something unexpected happened toward the end of this frozen era. As the climate began to stabilize and the ice slowly retreated, humans did something they had rarely done before. They stopped moving, and that decision, more than any storm or glacier, would transform the human story forever. As the Ice Age tightened its grip on the planet, humanity did not retreat into isolation. It spread. Slowly, unevenly, and without any sense of destination, human groups expanded into nearly every habitable corner of the Earth. This was not a single wave, nor a coordinated plan. It was a long process driven by countless small decisions: when to follow a herd, when to abandon a drying river, when to trust that land beyond the horizon might sustain life. Over time, these decisions accumulated into something extraordinary. Humans left Africa not once, but many times. Some journeys failed, some ended in dead ends. Others continued for generations, reshaping the genetic and cultural landscape of the species. Coastlines became migration corridors, offering predictable food sources and easier travel. Rivers guided movement inland. Mountains acted as barriers, but also as refuges. What makes this expansion remarkable is not its scale, but its consistency. Wherever humans went, they adapted. In frozen tundra, they learned to survive extreme cold. In dense forests, they adjusted hunting strategies and tools. In deserts, they tracked scarce water and mastered heat. In coastal regions, they incorporated marine life into their diet with remarkable efficiency. This adaptability suggests more than resilience. It suggests foresight. Migration is costly. It risks starvation, conflict, and exposure. To continue moving generation after generation requires confidence in shared knowledge and trust in collective decision-making. It requires a belief that survival lies ahead, not behind. That belief cannot be proven in advance. It must be accepted together. Some researchers describe Homo sapiens as the most successful invasive species the planet has ever known. The term is uncomfortable, but it captures something essential. Humans did not merely occupy new environments, they transformed them. Fire altered landscapes, hunting reshaped animal populations, movement connected ecosystems that had been separate for millennia. And yet, for most of this time, humans did not settle permanently. Even when conditions allowed stability, mobility remained the default. Flexibility was safety. Staying too long in one place risked depletion, conflict, and vulnerability to environmental change. This makes what happened next all the more puzzling. Toward the end of the last ice age, as climates warmed and ecosystems stabilized, humans in several regions independently made a choice they had rarely made before. They began to return to the same places year after year. Seasonal camps became semi-permanent. Semi-permanent sites became villages. The decision to stay was not sudden, and it was not universal. For thousands of years, mobility and settlement coexisted, but once some groups began to invest deeply in specific locations, clearing land, storing food, building structures, the balance shifted. Movement, once a strategy, became a liability. Remaining in place created new forms of security, but also new forms of risk. Crops could fail. Stored food could be stolen. Territory had to be defended. Population density increased. Disease spread more easily. Hierarchies emerged as control over land and resources became possible. From a long-term perspective, this shift is astonishing. For tens of thousands of years, humans survived by staying adaptable, light, and mobile. And then, within a relatively short span of time, many chose a path that restricted movement and tied survival to specific patches of land. Why? Some researchers point to climate stability. Others emphasize population pressure. Still others suggest that social and symbolic changes made settlement desirable. No single explanation is sufficient. What is clear is that this transition was not an obvious improvement for individuals living through it. Early agriculturalists often worked longer hours than hunter-gatherers. Their diets narrowed. Their health, in many cases, declined. Inequality increased. Violence became more organized. And yet, the shift continued. Once humans began to stay, they created systems that rewarded staying more. Land ownership, inheritance, and accumulation locked people into place. Over generations, the memory of mobility faded. What had once been a strength became a forgotten option. Looking back across the Ice Age, a pattern emerges. Humans were shaped by movement, uncertainty, and adaptation. Our bodies, minds, and social instincts evolved under conditions where flexibility mattered more than permanence. The restlessness that carried us across continents did not disappear when we settled down. It remained, embedded in our nervous systems. This may explain a quiet tension that still exists today. We live in fixed structures, governed by schedules and boundaries, yet we feel drawn to horizons, to travel, to change. We seek novelty, even when stability surrounds us. We feel unease when confined too long, even when we are safe. These impulses are not flaws. They are echoes. Echoes of a species that spent most of its existence moving through an uncertain world, guided by shared knowledge, belief, and trust in one another. A species shaped not by walls, but by paths. And as the Ice Age faded into memory and humans began to build the first permanent settlements, something else quietly began to take shape. A new relationship with the invisible. One that would follow humans into villages, cities, and civilizations, and change how they understood life, death, and meaning itself. Long before the first temples were built, long before gods were given names and hierarchies, humans were already behaving as if death did not mark a final boundary. The evidence is quiet but persistent. Across distant regions and deep stretches of time, archaeologists uncover graves that cannot be explained by practicality alone. Bodies positioned carefully, tools placed beside the dead, pigments scattered across bones, flowers laid where no living hands would ever return to see them. These acts required time, effort, and intention, resources that could not be spared casually in a world where survival was never guaranteed. These burials suggest something radical. They suggest that early humans believed the dead still mattered. In some cases, individuals were buried with items they had used in life, weapons, ornaments, objects worn close to the body. In others, the dead were treated with substances like red ochre, a pigment associated across cultures with blood, life, and transformation. These practices appear again and again, separated by thousands of years and vast distances, implying not coincidence, but shared intuition. This was not religion as we recognize it today. There were no sacred texts, no formal doctrines, no priestly class to enforce belief. But there was clearly a sense that existence extended beyond immediate perception, that something of a person endured after breath and movement ceased. And this belief shaped behavior. Caring for the dead is not necessary for survival in a narrow biological sense, but it is essential for something else: continuity, memory, identity. Burial practices reinforce the idea that individuals belong to a story larger than themselves, a story that does not end abruptly with death. For mobile societies, this was especially important. When groups moved through landscapes, graves anchored memory to place. They marked territory not in terms of ownership, but in terms of meaning. A valley was not just a hunting ground, it was where ancestors rested. A cave was not just shelter, it was where lives had ended and stories began. Some researchers suggest that early spiritual beliefs helped humans cope with uncertainty and loss. This may be true, but it is incomplete. These beliefs did more than soothe fear. They structured time. They linked past, present, and future into a single narrative. The living were not alone. They were accompanied by those who came before and responsible to those who would come after. In this way, spirituality became a social technology. It reinforced cooperation by extending consequences beyond the individual lifespan. Actions mattered not just for immediate survival, but for ancestral approval and group continuity. Moral behavior could be framed not as obedience to authority, but as alignment with forces larger than oneself. Crucially, these beliefs did not require certainty. They thrived in ambiguity. The invisible world was not mapped or defined. It was sensed, inferred, and negotiated through ritual. What mattered was not knowing exactly what lay beyond death, but agreeing that something did. And agreement, once again, was powerful. Groups that shared rituals surrounding death shared more than grief. They shared meaning. They reinforced bonds at moments of vulnerability. They transformed loss into cohesion. In a world where death was common and unpredictable, this may have been as important as any tool. The archaeological record cannot tell us what early humans believed in detail. We cannot hear their prayers or understand their symbols with confidence, but we can observe the patterns their actions left behind. And those patterns suggest that humans were already living within a layered reality, one foot in the physical world, the other in an invisible one. This invisible world did not disappear with settlement. It intensified. As humans began to stay in one place, burying their dead in the same ground year after year, the relationship between land, memory, and meaning deepened. Ancestors accumulated. Rituals grew more elaborate. The unseen began to take on structure. And from this structure, something new would emerge. Not just belief, but tradition. Not just tradition, but authority. And eventually, the first steps toward what we would later call civilization. As human groups began to return to the same places again and again, the invisible world they carried with them started to settle as well. What had once been fluid, stories adjusted to landscapes, rituals shaped by movement, now began to anchor itself to specific locations. The land itself became layered with meaning. Not just where people lived, but where ancestors rested, where rituals were performed, where the boundary between the visible and the unseen felt thinnest. This shift altered how knowledge was stored. In mobile societies, knowledge lived in people. It was carried in memory, in skill, in story. If a group fractured or disappeared, its knowledge often vanished with it. This fragility forced constant teaching and repetition. Wisdom survived only if it was practiced. Forgetting was dangerous. But permanence changed that relationship. As settlement stabilized, knowledge could attach itself to place. A burial ground preserved lineage. A ritual site preserved meaning. A path worn into the land preserved memory without words. Over time, these locations became repositories of shared understanding. You did not need to remember everything yourself. The landscape remembered with you. Some researchers suggest that this transition marked the beginning of a new kind of knowledge, less flexible but more durable. Practices became traditions. Traditions hardened into rules. Rules began to demand obedience not because they were immediately practical, but because they were inherited. At the same time, something else began to happen. As populations grew and remained close together, shared belief systems faced new pressure. In small groups, disagreement could be resolved through discussion or separation. In larger, denser communities, disagreement threatened stability. Belief needed enforcement. Rituals became more formal. Roles became more defined. Certain individuals emerged as specialists, keepers of stories, mediators with the invisible, interpreters of signs. Authority began to crystallize, not from force alone, but from control over meaning. This was not yet religion as we recognize it, but the foundation was forming. And with it came loss. When knowledge becomes attached to place and hierarchy, it becomes easier to preserve, but harder to adapt. Flexibility, once essential, began to diminish. Skills suited for mobility mattered less. Intimate ecological awareness narrowed as reliance shifted toward cultivated land and stored resources. The landscape was no longer a partner to be read, but a system to be managed. Some forms of knowledge faded quietly. Seasonal movement patterns were forgotten. Detailed understanding of wild ecosystems weakened. The ability to survive without permanent shelter or stored food became rare. These losses were not immediately catastrophic. Agriculture compensated. Storage compensated. Walls compensated. But compensation is not the same as replacement. What emerged was a new kind of human world, more stable, more predictable, but also more fragile in different ways. A drought could now devastate an entire community. Disease could spread rapidly. Conflict over territory became unavoidable. The invisible world, once a source of shared meaning, now also justified hierarchy, exclusion, and control. And yet, people did not experience this transition as a fall. They experienced it as necessity. Staying in one place felt safer. Surplus felt reassuring. Rituals felt grounding. The costs accumulated slowly across generations, often invisible to those living through the change. By the time consequences became clear, alternatives had been forgotten. This is why the idea of lost knowledge is so difficult to define. It was not erased in a single moment. It was not destroyed by catastrophe. It was gradually rendered unnecessary, then unintelligible, then unthinkable. Ways of living that had sustained humanity for tens of thousands of years became stories, then myths, then curiosities. But traces remained. In burial practices that echoed older rituals, in symbols whose meanings outlived their contexts, in human instincts that no longer matched their environment. The invisible world did not vanish. It reorganized. And as villages grew into towns and towns into cities, humans crossed a threshold they could not retreat from. The balance between movement and permanence tipped decisively. Civilization was beginning. Not as a sudden invention, but as an accumulation of choices, each reasonable, each adaptive in the moment, each carrying consequences that would only become clear much later. To understand what was gained and what was sacrificed, we must now step into that final turning point, the moment humans bound themselves to the land, reshaped time around work, and transformed belief into structure. Because the most dangerous invention in human history was not the wheel, or metal, or writing. It was the decision to stay. For most of human history, staying in one place was a risk. When resources declined, when climates shifted, when conflict threatened survival, movement was the solution. Mobility was not restlessness, it was intelligence expressed through action. And then, slowly, that logic began to reverse. Around 12,000 years ago, in several regions of the world, humans started returning to the same locations, not just seasonally, but permanently. These were not cities yet. They were camps that lingered longer than before. Huts repaired instead of abandoned. Storage pits dug into the earth. Paths worn deep by repeated use. At first, this did not look like a revolution. It looked like convenience. Certain places offered reliable water. Certain valleys supported dense plant growth. Certain animals returned predictably. Remaining nearby made sense. Over time, people began to intervene, clearing land, encouraging favored plants, discouraging others. What began as observation turned into management. This was the birth of agriculture. But not as a single idea or invention, it emerged gradually, almost accidentally, from practices meant to reduce uncertainty. Planting seeds near camp, protecting animals rather than chasing them, saving surplus for lean seasons. Each step seemed reasonable, yet together they altered the human relationship with time. For hunter-gatherers, time had been cyclical. Seasons returned, Movement followed patterns. If one place failed, another could be sought. Agriculture changed this rhythm. The future became something that had to be secured in advance. Fields demanded labor long before harvest. Failure was delayed but catastrophic. Staying in one place required commitment. Crops could not be carried. Fields could not be abandoned without loss. Storage created targets. Territory had to be defended. For the first time, humans became bound to specific plots of land, not symbolically, but materially. This binding reshaped social life. Population density increased, children survived at higher rates but required more resources. Surplus allowed specialization but also enabled inequality. Some controlled land, others worked it. Hierarchies emerged not because humans suddenly desired power, but because permanence made power possible. The archaeological record shows the consequences clearly. Early agricultural societies often display signs of declining health compared to their foraging predecessors. Bones show evidence of malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and disease associated with close living quarters. Diets narrowed, work intensified. And yet, the transition continued. Why would a way of life that demanded more labor and offered poorer health replace one that had sustained humanity for tens of thousands of years? Because agriculture changed the rules of competition. Farming populations grew faster. They expanded into surrounding territories. They absorbed or displaced mobile groups. Even if life was harder for individuals, farming societies outcompeted others at scale. Numbers became a weapon. Once this process began, it was difficult to stop. Groups that refused to adopt agriculture found themselves surrounded. Mobility became dangerous. Wild lands shrank. The old ways required space, and space was disappearing. Staying mobile was no longer simply a choice, it was a disadvantage. This is why agriculture is sometimes described as a trap. Not because it was irrational, but because it locked societies into a path with no easy exit. Each generation inherited fields, obligations, and expectations that narrowed possible futures. The memory of mobility faded. What had once been normal became unimaginable. The decision to stay did not feel like surrender. It felt like progress. And in many ways, it was. Agriculture supported larger populations, complex technologies, and eventually writing, architecture, and states. But it also introduced fragility on a scale humanity had never experienced before. Droughts could now destroy entire regions. Famine could spread rapidly. Conflict became organized and enduring. The most dangerous inventions are rarely weapons. They are systems that reshape incentives. By choosing to stay, humans transformed survival into production, time into labor, and land into power. The consequences would unfold over millennia, shaping everything from social inequality to warfare to the modern economy. And as these new systems took hold, something subtle but profound happened to human consciousness. The invisible world, once shared, fluid, and negotiated, began to harden. Belief became law, and law would soon demand obedience. Once humans committed to staying, survival no longer depended primarily on reading nature. It depended on managing people. In mobile societies, control was limited by movement. If leadership became oppressive, individuals could leave. Authority remained temporary, situational, and fragile. But permanent settlement changed this balance. When fields, homes, and graves anchored people to the land, leaving was no longer a simple option. Power could now accumulate. Those who controlled land controlled food. Those who controlled food controlled time, deciding who worked, when, and for what purpose. Surplus made it possible to support specialists, but it also made it possible to enforce dependency. A bad season no longer meant moving on. It meant submission, debt, or starvation. Slowly, survival transformed into obligation. The rhythms of life shifted. Days were no longer shaped primarily by weather and animal movement, but by planting cycles, storage schedules, and labor demands. Time became linear, measured by tasks completed rather than seasons observed. Work intensified, not because people suddenly valued productivity, but because staying in one place required constant maintenance. Fields must be protected, stores must be guarded, boundaries must be enforced. With these demands came new forms of conflict. Violence, once episodic and limited, became systematic. Fortifications appeared. Weapons evolved not just for hunting, but for combat between groups competing over territory. Warfare ceased to be an interruption of life and became a defining feature of it. At the same time, belief systems adapted to justify permanence. The invisible world, once flexible and negotiated, hardened into structure. Ancestors were no longer simply remembered, they were claimed. Land became sacred not because it was lived in, but because it was owned by lineage or sanctioned by unseen powers. Rituals began to reinforce hierarchy, presenting social order as cosmic order. This was not deception in the modern sense, it was coherence. Large, dense populations require shared narratives strong enough to suppress constant disagreement. Stories that once explained nature now explained authority. The will of spirits, ancestors, or gods aligned conveniently with the interests of those who managed resources. Over time, these narratives became difficult to challenge. To question authority was to question the order of the world itself. And yet, despite increasing control, humans did not experience this shift as loss. They experienced it as meaning. Permanent structures gave a sense of continuity. Monuments endured. Lineages could be traced. Achievements outlived individuals. For the first time, human lives felt anchored to something that would remain after death. Not just memory, but material presence. This was intoxicating. Civilization offered the promise of permanence in a world defined by decay. It offered stability in exchange for freedom, predictability in exchange for adaptability. Many accepted this trade willingly, unaware of its long-term cost. Because the cost was subtle. As societies grew more complex, individuals became more replaceable. Systems mattered more than people. Rules mattered more than relationships. The skills that once defined survival, ecological awareness, mobility, deep cooperation, became less relevant. In their place arose obedience, specialization, and endurance. Humans did not stop being shaped by evolution when they settled. Their bodies and minds remained tuned to a world of movement, variation, and social intimacy. But their environment no longer matched those expectations. The result was tension, felt as stress, dissatisfaction, and a persistent sense of disconnection. This tension did not resolve. It intensified as civilizations expanded. By the time cities emerged, with thousands living within walls, the old ways were no longer accessible. The knowledge that once allowed humans to live lightly on the land had faded into ritual, then into myth. What remained were echoes, stories of ancestors who lived closer to nature, tales of golden ages before corruption and decline. These stories appear again and again across cultures. They are not historical records. They are memories of loss. And they suggest that even as civilization grew more powerful, something within humans resisted complete transformation. Something remembered a different rhythm of life, one shaped by movement rather than control. To understand this resistance, to understand why modern humans still feel drawn to wilderness, firelight, and community, we must look not at cities, but at what survived beneath them. Because civilization did not erase the past, it buried it. And the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes that the ancestors we imagine as distant and primitive are not gone at all. They are still here, waiting beneath the structures we built on top of them. Civilization did not overwrite human nature. it layered itself on top of something far older. Beneath laws, schedules, and permanent structures, the human nervous system remains tuned to a world that no longer exists, a world of small groups, shared risk, and constant awareness. This is not metaphor. It is biology. Our bodies and minds evolved under conditions that shaped what feels safe, meaningful, and real. This is why certain experiences still affect us so deeply, even when we cannot explain why. Firelight draws attention in a way artificial light does not. Silence in a forest sharpens the senses instead of dulling them. Being surrounded by trusted people reduces stress more effectively than material security alone. These responses are not learned behaviors, they are inherited tendencies, shaped by tens of thousands of years spent in environments where attention meant survival and community meant life. Researchers studying stress, anxiety, and mental health increasingly point to a mismatch between modern environments and ancient expectations. Our brains are exceptionally good at managing immediate physical challenges. They are far less suited to constant abstraction, long-term pressure, and social systems scaled beyond personal recognition. In a hunter-gatherer world, danger was real but temporary. A predator appeared, the body responded, the threat passed. In a civilized world, threats are symbolic, persistent, and invisible. Deadlines, debt, status, uncertainty. The body reacts as if danger is constant because, from its perspective, it is. This mismatch may explain why so many people experience chronic stress in environments that are objectively safe. The problem is not weakness. It is context. Even our sense of time reflects this inheritance. Humans struggle with long-term planning, delayed rewards, and abstract futures because, for most of our history, survival depended on responding to what was immediately present. The future mattered, but it was imagined through seasonal cycles and communal memory, not numerical forecasts or distant goals. And yet, fragments of the old world persist. They surface in rituals that emphasize gathering, sharing food, and storytelling. They appear in the universal human tendency to mark transitions, birth, adulthood, death, with ceremony. They emerge in our fascination with origins, ancestors, and lost ages. Across cultures, myths describe a distant past when humans lived closer to the land, spoke with animals, or understood the world more clearly. These stories are not literal history. They are psychological truth. They reflect a deep awareness that something fundamental changed when humans settled, accumulated, and stratified. That a form of intimacy with nature, with one another, with time itself, was diminished, not destroyed, but buried beneath systems that required suppression of older instincts. Civilization asked humans to behave in ways their biology had not been shaped for, to sit still for long periods, to obey strangers, to work for abstract rewards, to accept inequality as normal. These adaptations were possible, but they were never effortless. This is why resistance never vanished. Throughout history, people have repeatedly fled cities for wilderness, formed communal movements, rejected hierarchy, or sought spiritual renewal through isolation and simplicity. These impulses are not anomalies. They are expressions of a persistent tension between inherited instincts and constructed systems. The ancestors did not disappear when civilization rose. They became internal. Their legacy is written not in monuments, but in the structure of the human mind, in the emotions that do not align with logic, in the longings that persist even when material needs are met, in the feeling that something essential is missing, even in a world of abundance. To understand what humans did before civilization is not merely to reconstruct the past. It is to recognize a version of ourselves that still exists, quietly influencing how we feel, think, and react. And this recognition leads to a final, unavoidable question. If the past is still alive within us, then what does it mean to move forward? What does progress look like for a species that never truly left its origins behind? If the ancestors never truly left, then traces of their world should still appear in ours, not as clear memories, but as distortions, longings, and contradictions that modern life cannot fully resolve. And they do. Across cultures and across time, humans have repeatedly imagined a lost age, a period before corruption, before hierarchy, before suffering became organized. These stories take many forms: golden ages, gardens, first peoples, ancestral times, but their structure is remarkably consistent. They describe a world where humans lived closer to nature, where communities were smaller, where meaning was immediate and shared. These myths are not evidence of a single historical moment. They are evidence of a shared psychological inheritance. They suggest that as civilizations grew more complex, humans became increasingly aware that something essential had been traded away. Not suddenly and not consciously, but gradually enough that the loss could only be felt, not clearly named. Even today, when people imagine escape from modern life, they rarely picture the future. They imagine return. Return to wilderness. Return to simplicity. Return to community. The language itself is revealing. Progress is something we are told we move toward. Peace is something we feel we move back to. This tension is not accidental. For tens of thousands of years, human identity was shaped by participation rather than position. You were not defined by what you owned or controlled, but by how well you contributed to the group. Status was temporary, earned through competence and generosity, and lost when it no longer served the collective. Survival required attention, humility, and responsiveness rather than dominance. Civilization inverted these values. Control replaced participation. Accumulation replaced balance. Permanence replaced adaptability. These shifts allowed societies to scale, but they also introduced forms of alienation unknown to earlier humans. People became separated from the sources of their food, the rhythms of their environment, and often from the consequences of their actions. In response, cultures developed coping mechanisms. Rituals attempted to restore connection. Festivals temporarily dissolved hierarchy. Religious practices offered belonging beyond social status. Art recreated experiences of awe and meaning once found in the natural world. These were not luxuries, they were psychological necessities. But they were also reminders. Reminders that modern systems alone could not satisfy inherited needs, that no amount of efficiency could replace the sense of being embedded in a living world, that no institution could fully substitute for the security of small-scale trust. This may explain why periods of rapid civilizational growth are often accompanied by spiritual unrest, philosophical questioning, and social fragmentation. As material conditions change faster than human instincts can adapt, meaning lags behind. The ancestors, in this sense, become symbols, not of a perfect past, but of a different alignment between human biology and human life. They represent a way of existing where survival, meaning, and community were not separate problems to be solved independently, but aspects of the same reality. And yet, this world cannot be fully recovered. The population densities, technologies, and environmental changes of the present make a complete return impossible. The old ways depended on conditions that no longer exist. To romanticize them is to misunderstand them. What matters is not return, but recognition. Recognition that the human story did not begin with cities, that civilization is a chapter, not the whole book. That beneath modern identities lies a deeper continuity connecting us to people who lived without writing, without walls, and without permanent ownership. When this continuity is acknowledged, the past becomes less distant. The fire you stare into, the unease you feel in isolation, the comfort of shared silence, the instinct to help without reward. These are not cultural accidents. They are inheritances. And perhaps this is why the question of what humans did before civilization refuses to disappear. It is not only about archaeology. It is about identity, about understanding which parts of ourselves are recent adaptations and which are ancient. Because once we see that civilization did not create us but reshaped us, we are forced to ask a more difficult question. If the ancestors are still here, living within us, then what kind of future are we building for them? And that question brings us to the final threshold. Not the beginning of history, but the moment we began to believe that history had a direction, a belief that would define everything that followed. At some point, humans stopped seeing time as a cycle and began to see it as a path. For most of pre-civilized existence, time returned. Seasons repeated. Lives echoed one another. The past was not behind, it was beneath, surrounding, instructing. Ancestors were not gone, they were present in stories, in places, in patterns of behavior that endured because they worked. Civilization altered this perception. With permanent settlements came records. With records came comparison. With comparison came hierarchy, not only between people but between eras. The past was no longer a source of guidance alone, it became something to be surpassed. This was the birth of progress as an idea. Progress suggests direction. It implies that history is moving toward something better, more advanced, more complete. It frames earlier ways of life as steps on a ladder rather than solutions in their own right. Once this idea takes hold, forgetting becomes easier. What lies behind is assumed to be inferior by definition. Writing accelerated this shift. When events could be fixed in time, ordered, and preserved, history became a narrative of accumulation. Innovations replaced older practices. Cities eclipsed villages. States absorbed tribes. Complexity increased, and increase itself became a measure of success. But this narrative hides its costs. Progress measures what is gained, not what is displaced. It celebrates permanence without acknowledging fragility. It rewards scale without accounting for strain. Under its logic, a society that produces more, grows faster, and expands further is assumed to be superior, even if it erodes the conditions that sustain human well-being. From this perspective, pre-civilized humanity appears stagnant. But stagnation is not the same as stability. For tens of thousands of years, humans maintained ways of life that were resilient across dramatic environmental change. They adapted without collapsing. They endured without exhausting their surroundings. By any biological standard, this is success. Yet it does not fit the narrative of progress because it does not point forward. Civilization reframed success as transformation rather than balance. This reframing reshaped memory itself. Practices that could not scale were discarded. Knowledge that could not be centralized was ignored. Ways of living that resisted hierarchy were labeled primitive. The past became something to escape, not understand. And once this belief took hold, it justified everything that followed. Forests were cleared in the name of improvement. Rivers were redirected for efficiency. Communities were reorganized to serve production. Even human relationships became resources. Labor to be optimized, loyalty to be extracted, time to be managed. Progress promised meaning through movement, but it also demanded sacrifice. Those sacrifices were rarely framed as losses. They were reframed as necessities. Pain became transitional. Disruption became temporary. The present was endured for the sake of a future that always remained just out of reach. This belief is powerful. It allows societies to tolerate inequality by promising eventual reward. It justifies environmental damage by invoking long-term benefit. It encourages obedience by presenting authority as a vehicle for advancement. And yet, despite centuries of progress, a strange pattern persists. The future never arrives. Each generation inherits unresolved tension between abundance and anxiety, between connection and isolation, between technological power and psychological strain. The latter continues upward, but satisfaction does not follow at the same pace, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if progress, as a concept, is incomplete? What if it measures the wrong things? What if the forward motion of civilization has carried humanity away from forms of well-being that are difficult to quantify, but essential to being human? To explore this possibility, we must examine the other side of the equation. Not what civilization built, but what it quietly dismantled. Because the cost of believing history points forward may be the gradual erasure of everything that does not fit that direction. And that brings us to the final question, not about the past, not about the future, but about choice. Every system reveals its values by what it preserves and by what it allows to disappear. As civilization advanced, it preserved tools, structures, and records with increasing efficiency. Knowledge that could be written down survived. Knowledge that could be centralized endured. Knowledge that produced measurable output was rewarded. But much of what sustained pre-civilized humanity did not meet these criteria. Skills rooted in constant observation of the natural world began to fade as fewer people depended on them. Intimate understanding of ecosystems narrowed into specialized expertise, accessible only to some. Communal decision-making gave way to formal authority. Trust, once reinforced daily through shared survival, was outsourced to institutions. These changes were not malicious, they were practical. Yet practicality has a way of redefining necessity. As societies grew larger, they required simplification. Rules replaced relationships. Categories replaced individuals. Systems replaced memory. This allowed coordination at scale, but it also reduced the richness of daily human experience. One of the most significant losses was context. In small groups, actions had immediate, visible consequences. If resources were overused, scarcity followed. If cooperation failed, survival was threatened. Feedback was direct, learning was constant, responsibility was shared. In large, complex societies, feedback became delayed and abstract. Consequences were distributed across distance and time. Responsibility diffused. Individuals acted within systems they could not fully see or influence. The connection between action and outcome weakened. This disconnection altered moral reasoning. Right and wrong became codified rather than negotiated. Obedience replaced judgment. Compliance replaced participation. People learned to follow rules rather than read situations. This shift made large-scale organization possible, but it also made individuals more dependent, more constrained, and more alienated from the results of their own labor. Even time itself was transformed. In pre-civilized life, time was experienced through change, light, temperature, growth, decay. In civilized life, time became segmented, quantified, and owned. Hours were allocated. Days were scheduled. Life was divided into phases of productivity and rest defined externally. This restructuring of time allowed unprecedented coordination, but it also introduced a new kind of pressure. The future became something to be prepared for rather than lived toward naturally. The present became a means rather than an end. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, humans began to forget another way of being. Not because it was inferior, but because it no longer fit. Ways of life that prioritized balance over expansion, sufficiency over surplus, and relationship over control became increasingly incompatible with growing systems. They were pushed to the margins, geographically, culturally, and psychologically. What remained of them was often romanticized or dismissed. The wild became something to escape to briefly, not live within. Community became something to schedule, not depend on. Meaning became something to search for, rather than something embedded in daily survival. Yet despite this forgetting, the tension never resolved. Even in the most advanced societies, people continue to feel unmoored. They experience abundance without security, information without understanding, connection without belonging. These are not failures of technology. They are symptoms of a deeper misalignment. Because progress optimized for scale, not for the human organism. It excelled at producing structures. It struggled to preserve coherence between biology, psychology, and social life. The further civilization advanced, the more it relied on mechanisms to manage the consequences of this gap: entertainment, ideology, consumption, distraction. These mechanisms soothe, but they do not resolve. And this leads to an uncomfortable realization. The question of what humans did before civilization is not merely historical. It is diagnostic. It reveals a reference point, a long-tested way of aligning human life with human nature, not to be copied, not to be revived wholesale, but to be understood. Because without that understanding, civilization risks mistaking acceleration for direction and complexity for improvement. And once that happens, the idea of progress becomes self-justifying. It no longer needs to ask where it is going, only how fast it can get there. Which brings us to the final chapter of this story. Not a conclusion, but a reflection. Because after 100,000 years of forgetting, the most important question is no longer what we were. It is what we choose to remember. Imagine for a moment a single ordinary day. Not a dramatic one, no catastrophe, no triumph. Just a day. Before the sun rises, a small group of humans stirs. There is no alarm, no schedule written anywhere. Bodies wake because light changes, because temperature shifts, because habit has been shaped by seasons rather than clocks. Someone tends a fire that never fully died during the night. Someone listens to wind, to distant movement, to the silence that tells them nothing dangerous is near. No one is alone. Food is not purchased, it is remembered. Where certain plants grow after rain, where animals passed days ago. Knowledge is carried in minds, shared through glances and gestures as much as words. Decisions are made collectively, often without formal discussion. Survival is not an individual project. It never was. As the day unfolds, movement is constant but unhurried. Walking, watching, waiting. Effort comes in bursts, focused, physical, real, followed by long stretches of calm. When danger appears, the body responds fully. When it passes, the body rests. Stress has a beginning and an end. As night returns, people gather again. Stories are told, not for entertainment alone, but to preserve memory, to remind children who they are, to explain why certain places matter. Firelight dances across faces, shaped by lives of exposure, attention, and shared risk. Nothing about this day is recorded. Nothing about it will survive in writing. And yet, days like this sustained humanity for tens of thousands of years. Now imagine another day, the one you are more familiar with. You wake to a sound designed to pull you out of sleep whether your body is ready or not. Light comes from screens before it comes from the sky. Information arrives immediately. Messages, alerts, expectations. You are surrounded by people, yet functionally alone. Survival is abstract, mediated through systems you did not build and cannot see. Movement is limited. Stress is constant. Threats are invisible but unending. The body prepares for danger that never arrives and cannot fully recover because it never truly leaves. Time is no longer cyclical. It is counted, sold, spent. At night there may be light everywhere, yet darkness inside. Silence is uncomfortable. Stillness feels wrong. The fire has been replaced by a screen that flickers endlessly but warms nothing. This day is documented in detail, every action logged, every transaction stored. And yet, meaning feels strangely elusive. The point is not that one life is better than the other. That comparison is too simple. The point is that these 2 days are lived by the same species, using the same brain, governed by the same nervous system. The difference is context. Our ancestors were not smarter. They were not purer. They were adapted to a world that matched the human organism. A world where attention mattered, where relationships were survival, where meaning was not searched for, it was unavoidable. Civilization did not erase this design. It ignored it, which is why so many modern comforts fail to comfort, which is why abundance does not quiet anxiety, which is why people surrounded by others feel alone. These are not personal failings. They are signals. Signals that the lives we live are out of alignment with the minds we inherited. The ancestors we imagine as distant are closer than we think. They are present in our reflexes, our longings, our unease. They surface when we sit by fire, when we walk in silence, when we feel most ourselves, far from systems and schedules. The lost years before civilization were not lost at all. They were formative. And they continue to speak, not in words, but in feeling. The question is whether we are still capable of listening. If the ancestors were standing beside us now, watching the world we have built, they would not recognize our machines. They would not understand our cities. They would struggle to grasp why so many humans live among millions of others, yet feel so isolated. But they would recognize something else immediately. They would recognize the fear. Not fear of predators or storms, but fear that never resolves. Fear stretched thin across months and years. Fear without a clear source. They would see bodies constantly preparing for danger that never fully arrives, and they would understand that something is wrong. They would recognize our hunger as well. Not hunger for food, but hunger for belonging, for meaning that does not require explanation, for a sense that daily effort contributes to something real, shared, and immediate. These hungers are ancient. They once had clear answers. Civilization complicated them. We often assume that history moves forward by necessity, that each stage replaces the last because it is superior. But the deep past tells a different story. It tells us that humanity did not advance in a straight line. It adapted. It negotiated. It survived by fitting itself carefully into the world around it. Civilization reversed that relationship. Instead of fitting ourselves to the world, we reshaped the world to fit our systems. At first, this seemed like liberation. Control replaced uncertainty. Permanence replaced movement. But over time, control created fragility. Permanence created dependence. The question we face now is not whether civilization was a mistake. That question belongs to hindsight, not understanding. The real question is whether a species shaped by 100,000 years of one way of living can indefinitely sustain a way of life that contradicts its deepest design. There is no answer carved in stone. What exists instead is attention, one that runs through history, through psychology, through every modern society. Attention between scale and intimacy, between efficiency and meaning, between progress and coherence. The ancestors did not solve these problems. They never had to face them at this scale. But they did understand limits. They understood feedback. They understood that survival depended on listening to land, to one another, to signals that could not be ignored without consequence. We live in a world that excels at ignoring signals. signals from ecosystems pushed beyond balance, signals from bodies under constant stress, signals from communities fragmenting under abstraction. The danger is not collapse. The danger is gradual numbness, the loss of the ability to notice when something fundamental is wrong. Remembering the deep past does not give us answers. It gives us perspective. It reminds us that being human once meant living within constraints, not conquering them. That meaning once emerged from participation, not accumulation. That well-being was once inseparable from relationship, with people, with place, with time itself. The future will not be shaped by returning to that world. It cannot be. But it may depend on whether we can carry its lessons forward, whether we can design systems that respect human limits as much as human ambition, whether we can redefine progress to include psychological and social coherence, whether we can remember that survival and living well are not the same thing. The 100,000 years before civilization are not a forgotten preface. They are the foundation upon which everything else rests. And the question that remains is not what our ancestors would think of us. It is whether we are willing to build a future that their minds, and ours, can truly endure.